How did Canada and the United States become separate countries? Did Canada and the USA ever come close to being one nation? Let's find out with the help of Dan Snow's History Hit.
The history of US and Canada. Annexed Canada in 1911 to bring that northern resource powerhouse into the American Republic, fulfilling the dream of so many American expansionists for generations. The response to this in Canada was immediate. Anti-Americanism flourished. The press went full patriot. Canadians talked about boycotting US goods, absolutely determined. It became the main issue at stake in that year's election. Obviously, friends, I'm talking about 1911, when a reduction in tariffs drove the Canadians to rally around their flag and reject what they saw was American expansionism through economic means. Why is Canada separate independence, and why is the border where it is? Various moments over the last 250 years in which the issue of Canadian annexation has been raised by American leaders, and sometimes successfully. In fact, large chunks of historic Canada are already in the USA. From the birth of the American Republic, there's nearly always been a lobby within the United States, which has believed in the maximalist approach to expansion. And you can see that because not only has America vastly expanded from its initial Revolutionary era borders, but there have been calls to go further in pretty much every direction. In 1847, when the US Army captured Mexico City, there was the famous All of Mexico rallying slogan. The demand that the Americans build on their success in that Mexican War by annexing the entire country. Instead, the Americans opted just to take what is now California in the American Southwest. But there was a big debate about whether or not to take the whole thing. I spent summer vacations touring the many battlefields of southern Ontario where American invasion forces were put to the sword. This is the story of the United States and Canada and why they're not the same thing. With US history, we have to go back before the existence of the United States of America itself. In roughly the first half of the 18th century, give or take, North America looked very different politically to today. Various European empires had carved out imperial possessions or colonies within North America. Those existed in competition with or alongside indigenous tribal homes, kingdoms, empires that stretched right the way across the continent. We have a British claim to the shores of Hudson Bay. Now, the British had outsourced that particular piece of colonial adventurism to a commercial company, the Hudson Bay Company, and they just established trading posts to buy valuable animal furs from indigenous people to make coats and hats to sell to Europeans. This is not a colony as we understand it. This is the thinnest of territorial claims. It's a handful of British outposts, a tiny number of agents. These are not the start of big settler communities. So more importantly, let's move south and get to what we today call modern Canada. That space, much of it was claimed by the French, who sent their explorers up the St. Lawrence River and through the river system of Canada and covering extraordinary distances through the 17th and early 18th centuries. So it's claimed by the French, thinly held. There aren't big communities of French-speaking expats, French migrants all over what is today Manitoba and Saskatchewan. That's just not there yet. There are a few big towns along the St. Lawrence, like Trois-Rivières and Quebec City and Montreal, but mostly it's a series of forts which flew the French flag and acted as a safe place for French trappers and merchants to touch base. They were there buying furs from indigenous peoples. They were there hunting, trapping those animals themselves. So that's from the mouth of St. Lawrence, what is today Labrador in the north, New Brunswick in the south, right the way through modern Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. That's all a French empire. The French also claimed a giant chunk of territory, which takes us all the way down through the US Midwest to Illinois. Detroit is Detroit, meaning the Straight River. Pittsburgh used to be Fort Duquesne. And on it went, covering really the mighty Mississippi drainage area to the south, all the way down to Louisiana, named after King Louis, obviously, Louis XIV. Memphis, Tennessee was once Fort Assomption, and it goes all the way down to the Gulf Coast, and New Orleans, named after the city in France. Out to the west, the Spanish claimed to rule. The Spanish Empire, which had swatted aside the Inca and the Aztecs, had certainly made its match in the warlike Comanche, so most of those Spanish claims were paper claims at best. The Spanish did, however, rule over Florida. So only in the very east, along the Atlantic seaboard of North America, from what is now Maine down to Georgia, do we find the famous 13 British colonies. A strip of land that's roughly sandwiched between the Appalachians and the Atlantic. These might not be very big, but they are settler colonies. They got dense communities of farmers, tradesmen, and city folk. They've got sophisticated, dynamic civil and political institutions. They've got traditions. There have been British settlers in those places now for over 100 years, and that's important. The first important change does come during the early 18th century. The British chased the French out of the rather glamorous-sounding Acadia. That's modern Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, basically. So those the maritime provinces of modern Canada, right on the Atlantic, just north of Maine, on the mouth of the St. Lawrence. So those were all French, it was Acadia, and after decades of trying, the British secured most of this territory in the early 18th century, and they made a very big and interesting decision, one usually beyond the means of an early modern state. They decided to ethnically cleanse Acadia. They expelled the French Catholic settlers and they replaced them largely with British or British colonial, English-speaking Protestant ones. So this area becomes Nova Scotia. Really, it's a 14th colony, another one of those Atlantic seaboard colonies, right, just north of what is today Maine. Now, further along, you'll be thinking we do have Newfoundland, but that really just had a few fishing settlements on it. It had been absolutely wiped out several times over. It's constantly being fought over and smashed and burned. It was not a sort of thriving colony. It was more a frontier zone. So that's under direct British Crown control. The next big change comes right in the middle of the 18th century, and that is the French-Indian War, the 7 Years' War of the 1750s and early 60s. And the British score the most astonishing win in military history. They managed to drive the French entirely out of North America. So that all the land that I've described, all the stuff going through Canada, all the stuff down through the Midwest, into the Mississippi Basin, down to the Gulf, all that ends up as British. And in fact, for good measure, the British also took Florida too off the Spanish. That becomes British as well. We're talking Alexander the Great levels of conquest here. I mean, it's wild. So suddenly, British North America is its 13 colonies, New York's, New Virginia's, Carolinas and everything, plus Nova Scotia, so 14 colonies, and the whole of New France, so Canada. That includes Louisiana, Illinois, and everything. So the British control this vast empire, really the whole of the western half of North America. Within 15 years of that astonishing victory, why did the 13 colonies, and just the 13 colonies, rebel against the British Empire, break away, establish the USA, and why didn't they take all of the rest with them? That's the big question. That, in an important sense, is unresolved history, resolving that essential question. Those American rebels in those 13 colonies, well, they thought that the rest of all of those British possessions should or would break away with them. As the 13 colonies declared their independence, they sent messages. They reached out to Nova Scotia and Canada and Florida, and they invited the people there to join the American Revolution. And there was some interest. Canada, in particular, if you look at the Articles of Confederation, so one of the sort of founding documents of this revolutionary republic, Canada was pre-approved for joining. Any other applicants would have to go through a process. Canada could just join. Boom, rubber stamped. There was some interest in joining, particularly in Nova Scotia, but ultimately, the areas that make up Canada today opted not to rebel. And that's a big moment. Why? Why did so much of British North America opt to stay within the British Empire? Well, let's deal with Nova Scotia first, because I think that could have gone the other way. Nova Scotia was a bit different to the other 13 colonies. In those colonies, you had settlers who'd been there for generations. They had cherished traditions of local representative government. They had an aversion to being taxed by London. There was a powerful and distinct political culture in those colonies that set them apart ultimately from London. But in Nova Scotia, well, it's a majority of people who'd just recently arrived from Britain. They didn't really mind, therefore, London rule. They were kind of used to it. Also, Nova Scotia had only just been prized from the grip of its French owners. The British settlers there probably quite liked having British redcoats to keep the peace, to make sure both the French couldn't come back and indigenous people were controlled. It all felt a bit too real. Also, it was more difficult to get to. It wasn't connected by road to the other 13. To get there from the colonies meant a sea voyage, which meant it was sort of vulnerable to British naval interception. So George Washington was never, during the war, going to pack his entire army into ships and run the British naval gauntlet, only to liberate the people of Nova Scotia. That's why Nova Scotia ultimately said no during the revolution, and also why the revolutionaries didn't try and spread the revolution by force to Nova Scotia.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.